Shine within our hearts, loving Master, the pure light of your divine knowledge, and open the eyes of our minds to understand the message of your gospel. Instill in us also the reverence for your blessed commandments, so putting down all sinful desires, we pursue a spiritual life, thinking and doing all those things that are well-pleasing to you. We are blessed together at the beginning with Father, and your all-holy, good, and life-creating Spirit, now and forever, to the ages of ages.
Amen.
Amen. All right, so let's review. What did we talk about last week?
Jacob meeting his brother.
Mm-hmm.
Esau.
What was interesting about that?
Well, Jacob was afraid of Esau because
He stole his birthright.
Mm-hmm.
he was afraid to meet with him. Esau actually bowed down to him instead of like coming against him. Actually came with peace.
Mm-hmm.
So that was the blessing for Jacob.
What happened right before that, though? What did Jacob do prior to?
He wrestled with God.
He wrestled with God, and what happened in that?
Well, he got a new name.
Mm-hmm. What's his new name?
Israel.
Which means
His new name was Israel.
right. His new name is Israel, which means God prevails.
Right.
Which is God is victorious. Which is interesting because Jacob was the one that prevailed over, not over Esau, over the angel. And yet the term is God prevails. Why was that important? Why was it important that, first of all, that Jacob had that moment where he wrestles with God and win? And then why was it important that he gets this new name? And why is that important at all, especially right before he meets Esau?
Shows
One God.
Sister Maya, sorry, we're having difficulty hearing you.
Oh, I said to show that there's one God, not the God of the mountain, but the God of all the people. One God.
It's not necessarily about having to do with polytheism versus monotheism. It has more to do with the idea that Jacob trusts in God, that you're afraid, you're terrified of what is going to happen. God is the one who's victorious. God prevails. God will defend you. God is in your corner, essentially. You have nothing to be afraid of. That I will allow you to go forward. I will be with you. So the whole concept that God prevails is present here. And this is the start. What is the 12 tribes of what?
Israel.
Israel. The term Israel literally means God prevails, which means the nation, the people, all should be trusting that God will take care of you. God is with you.
I have my little pen that I got before I went to Israel.
Word of God. So, Jacob, we keep calling him Jacob now just so that we can have continuity's sake. But for all intents and purposes, he is no longer Jacob. In the same way that Abraham is no longer Abram. This is a new identity, a new person. And this was done a second time, where God again appears before Jacob and says, your name is Israel. When things happen multiple times in the Bible, it is because it's trying to show the significance of the moment. It's repeated again and again so that it stays with us. So we're going to go ahead and continue with chapter 35, verse 23. Now the sons of Jacob were 12. The sons of Leah were Reuben, Jacob's firstborn, and Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, and Zebulun. The sons of Rachel were Joseph and Benjamin. The sons of Bilhah, Rachel's maidservant, were Dan and Naphtali. The sons of Zilpah, Leah's maidservant, were Gad and Asher. These were the sons of Jacob who were born to him in Mesopotamia of Syria. So, this is going to get complex. But it also shows that God is not afraid of complexities. Because despite the fact that everything was talking about the idea of the generations coming from the legal line, So remember that it had to come from Sarah. It could not come from her handmaiden. So, and yet, within Jacob, within Israel, we see 4 different genealogies. 2 of them legal, 2 of them illegal, and yet we don't refer to them as, okay, only the children of Rachel, or only the children of Leah, or only the children of Leah and Rachel, but we're also counting the children that were from the maidservants. And so this is a complexity.
Now, why did the line of Judah end up being the line that Jesus came from?
Very good question. And again, this is to further delineate the idea as it does not have to be the firstborn. That it is coming from those that exist through the promise. And this is significant because, after all, with the whole Jacob and Esau, who should have been the one to receive the promise? Esau. Who should have received the birthright? Esau. And
Why did Rachel pull that deceit?
well, we discussed that at length in the Bible study, talking about it. It was mainly because it wasn't just because she favored her second first. It was because Esau had married into foreign tribes, was worshiping foreign gods, and was no longer worshiping in the right way. And even now, when Jacob met with Esau, Esau was still worshiping other things. He was not worshiping the God of Israel. And so this shows us that it was the right decision because they saw the blessing of God as like a magical talisman instead of being a relationship with God, which is what it is supposed to be. So we see this also within the meeting of Esau and Jacob, that Jacob, despite the fact that he's calling Esau his Lord and being subservient and showing deference to him, still says, I have the blessing of God. That is not negotiable. That is not something that is going to change. And so this blessing and being the heir shows that this is not just biological. Now, as for the line of the 12 tribes, well, it's going to get more and more complex as we go down. But we're going to see now that the 12 tribes of Israel now are a whole. That we're not even looking at it now as just one. It's all 12 tribes. And this is symbolic because these 12 get revisited again, because now there's not just the 12 sons. And we saw this prior too with Noah, if you recall. The sons of Noah were separated into 3 distinct nations and people. Well, same here. The 12 sons of Jacob are now not just the 12 sons of Israel, but the 12 what? Tribes. So they're like mini kingdoms, mini nations.
12 is an important number.
Exactly. This is where we see the numerology of Scripture. 3, 12, 40, 9, 7. And so the 12 tribes of Israel are important because, if you recall, they asked Jesus, and what about us who have left everything? What will we receive? And what did Jesus Christ tell them? You will sit on the 12 thrones, which symbolizes that these 12, again, even though they came from 4 disparate mothers, symbolize the entirety of the kingdom.
In the 4 gates of Israel, there's like certain tribes that are going to be representative of each gate.
Right. So, continuing on to verse 27. Then Jacob came to his father Isaac at Mamre, or Kidjar Arba, that is Hebron, where Abraham and Isaac sojourned. Now the days of Isaac were 180 years. So Isaac breathed his last and died, and was gathered to his people, being old and full of days. Thus his son Esau and Jacob buried him. Now, this is the genealogy of Esau, who is Edom. Esau took his wives from the daughters of the Canaanites, Adah, the daughters of Elon the Hittite, Aholibamah, the daughter of Anah, the daughter of Zibeon the Hivite, and Basanath, Ishmael's daughter, sister of Nabashah. Now Adah bore Eliphaz to Esau, and Basmath bore Raul, and Aholibamah bore Jush, and Jalam and Korah. These were the sons of Esau who were born to him in the land of Canaan. Then Esau took his wives, his sons, his daughters, and all the persons of his household, his cattle, and all his animals, and all his goods he gained in the land of Canaan, and went to a country away from the presence of his brother Jacob. For their possessions were too great for them to dwell together, and the land of their sojourn could not support them because of their abundance. So Esau dwelt at Mount Seir. Esau is Edom. So again, more complexities because there's different names for different places and different individuals.
Isn't Edom Jordan right now?
Right. And so what we're seeing here is that the blessings of God, despite the fact that Esau is not worshiping correctly, God is still blessing him. In the same way that the other children that are not of the lineage are blessed. That the blessings are so great that they can't even stay together because there's so much abundance. Now, this is the genealogy of Esau, the father of the Edomites in Mount Seir. These were the names of Esau's sons. Oh, did I? Eliphaz, the son of Ada, the wife of Esau, and Reuel, the sons of Basemath, the wife of Esau. The sons of Eliphaz were Teman, Omar, Zepho, Gatam, and Kenaz. Now, Tilma was the concubine of Eliphaz, Esau's son, and she bore Amalek to Eliphaz. These were the sons of Ada, Esau's wife. These were the sons of Reuel, Naphaz, Zerah, Shema, and Miza. These were the sons of Bethmeth, Esau's wife. These were the sons of Abimelech, Esau's wife, and the daughter of Anna, the daughters of Zibeon. She bore to Esau Jeush, Jalam, and Korah. So we're seeing here that the Israelites care a lot about history. They care about, okay, who are all the genealogies? They care about the family tree. These were the chiefs of the sons of Esau. The sons of Eliphaz, the firstborn Esau, were Chief Teman, Chief Omar, Chief Zepho, Kazan, Chief Korah, Chief Gatam, Chief Amalek. These were the chiefs of Eliphaz in the land of Edom. These were the sons of Ada. These were the sons of Reuel, Esau's sons. And basically, it keeps on going and going and going and going and going. And it says, skipping ahead to verse 31, now these were the kings who reigned in the land of Edom before any king reigned over the children of Israel. Balak, the son of Beor, reigned in Edom, and the name of the city was Dinhabah. So in Balak, Jacob, the son of Zerah of Bahar, reigned in his place. Now when Jabab died, Hashram in the land of Temanites reigned in his place. When Shemam died, Hadad, the son of Barad, who attacked Midian in the field of Moab, reigned in his place. The name of his city was Gethaim. When Hadad died, Shemelah and Maskarek reigned in his place. When Shemelah died, Saul of Rabah by the river reigned in his place. When Saul died, Baal-Baham, the son of Akar, reigned in his place. And when Baal-Haman, the son of Akar, died, Harad, the son of Barad, reigned in his place. And the name of his city is Phokar. His wife's name was Mehetabel, the daughter of Matrid, the daughter of Mizabah. These were the names of the chiefs of Esau, their tribes and palaces, in their countries and nations, and so forth and so forth. Esau, father of Edomites. So, what we now see is that Esau was taken care of. Before we move on past this huge litany of genealogy and kings and places that can be very overwhelming when you look at it, there are any questions?
So how many of these people actually had primary roles?
That's the fun part. None. But the reason why they're there is because despite the fact that we don't see them as having a primary role, the Israelites would. Because keep in mind, this is all talking about the areas around them, the nation states, the kings, the queens. And so even though it's not directly related to their individual story, it's important for the context of understanding what's going on all around them. Understand, okay, this is why that country over there has their leadership. This is why that country over there has their leadership. So it's almost like the equivalent of in our high school taking European history, where we're looking at, okay, this is what's going on all around us.
Aren't all the descendants of Esau in the Middle East right now? Oh, this one surrounding Israel.
Basically, that's the whole concept. And the same thing, too, with Abraham's son Ishmael, that also it's talking about not just because it's Abraham's son, but the idea that all of their people have passed out and gone through. And the same thing with Noah's children. So this is about the history of not just the land of Judah, because for all intents and purposes, that's what Moses is looking at, Judea. But it's talking about the history of everywhere around them, which is important for them because we have to understand that the Israelites, we're talking about kings and queens. We are not talking about the same way that we're talking about, let's say, Egypt and the pharaohs. Those were kingdoms. So even here, when we're talking about kings, we're not talking about the massive amounts of people that we would be associating kings and queens and kingdoms. These are very small. This is one of the reasons why when we're really looking at the people of Israel, it's almost like a blip on the radar. This is something that the rest of history would have seen as, that's not even worth talking about. The only reason we even talk about this is because of Christ. If it wasn't for Jesus Christ and the complete conversion of Western civilization to follow after Christianity, Jews and Judaism, it would be the equivalent of looking at one of the religions in India. Now we call Hindu, the religion of India. Well, that's not really a fair statement because there's hundreds and hundreds of religions in India. So this would just be looked at as one of the monotheistic religions in the Middle East. So for them, however, this is important. This is their history, their story. And it's being told from the perspective of oral tradition all the way down to Moses. And so for them, this is important for them to say, this is who we are. And this is how we understand the world around us.
So is this the unifying element?
It definitely was. And this is one of the reasons why, again, despite we talk about unifying, about another reason why we say that there are multiple authors of the Pentateuch. That Moses did not write this himself. We're 100% positive that there were multiple authors.
We know that he didn't write the part about his death. Somebody had to write that.
Well, and not only just that, but if we look at just the creation in the beginning of Genesis, why are there 3 creation stories? If it's one author, one person telling the story, it would make sense that there would only be one statement of creation, how man came to be. And yet we see it 3 times.
We know who might be the other or the others.
We are not 100% sure. There is the Eloistic, the kingly. So the Eloistic is more concerned about the theology behind it. The kingly one is talking more about the politics behind it. So there's 3 or 4 different potential authors, and each of them would write basically with their context of what they thought history was most important to them. We also see possibly coming forward from the idea of the Talmud. Now, is everyone familiar with what the Talmud is?
Yeah.
Okay, so the Talmud is, let's say we've got the Bible, and we've got the text. The Talmud is essentially the writing in the lines around it, which is basically scholarly work giving interpretation. Now, for us, we're looking at this the exact same thing. In our Orthodox study Bibles, we have these little subsections, the little notes from theologians. Well, the Talmud, even from the earliest times, they would have their basically written commentary on the text around it. Now, they didn't have the Gutenberg printing press like we do, where we're able to just keep feeding it. So how were they getting books? How would you have another Bible? Someone would have to sit down and handwrite it in. Well, over time, sometimes it might have been accidental. Maybe some of the writing from the Talmud was so close to the actual text that there's that was meant to be in the actual text. And so that would get copied in. Other times, which is fortunately or unfortunately, because the reality is that if we look at every word of the Bible, the reality is every word does have significance and meaning, even if the way it got in there may not have been the best. Other times, the people that were writing the copying would say, well, you know what? I want to make sure that this element is in there. So they would take that part of the Talmud out of the Talmud and splice it into the actual text. And so this would continue. And on top of that, it still was being passed down orally. So how are we supposed to know if the oral tradition that you're hearing is from the one that does not have that Talmud splice, or the one that does have that Talmud splice? I mean, just look at ourselves here. Within our own liturgical traditions, we see something that's done for 20 years, we think that that's antiquity. That's the way it's always been. And then when you may find something that is part of the ancient liturgical practices that have been going back for hundreds of years, you're like, whoa, what is this weird new innovation? When in reality, A, it's not an innovation, it's actually older. But this is how we frame ourselves, especially when it's within our own life, our own history. And so that is how a lot of the Old Testament, especially the Pentateuch, came to be. And why these things are important, because different individuals felt that that was important, that was critically important to be there. Even though, for all intents and purposes, for us looking at the story, we wouldn't even look at that. And this is parts of Genesis. Never mind looking at the book of Numbers. Where it gets even more into the minutiae and grass of details that most people, when they're looking at, okay, what's the story of God and his people, we look at it like, okay, how is this important to me? Converse that with the New Testament. With the New Testament, even though, again, there's different authors, different perspectives, different historical things, so that there are some contradictions, and yet the message is still on point, all the same. And the characters are not as much. There's not as many characters. I mean, you still are able to say of the 70 or of the 12. But each of the people there have less of the idea of the historical antiquity of like, okay, this is a name, part of 100 names. We do still see this in the genealogy of Luke and the genealogy of Matthew. But for the characters of the New Testament going forward, it's not as many. It's not as much. And even though it's 2,000 years ago for us, for those at the time, it was like, okay, this isn't ancient history for us. This is the present. So when we're talking about Olympia the deaconess, we know who she is. Or Chloe's household, we know who she is. Well, exactly, because for us now, it's 2,000 years past. But when it was being written, even if it was 100 years after the fact, when we were compiling the New Testament, for them it was still recent enough that these would be characters that they knew about.
Isn't Mark the first book that was written in the New Testament?
Correct.
Peter would actually.
This is a historical thing that most scholars will, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Well, not exactly. If we're going chronologically, Luke would probably be the last, not John. John is last because of the difference in theological style. So we have the synoptics together. Whether Mark or Matthew came first is kind of hard to tell. They were probably written basically in tandem because they're different perspectives and in different places. Mark is, for all intents and purposes, Mark is the gospel according to St. Peter.
By Peter?
No, it wasn't written by Peter, but for all intents and purposes, it might as well have been, because Mark was a disciple of St. Peter. So the Gospel of Mark was written in Rome. We also know pretty much when Mark was written based on the urgency. Now, why would it matter? I know we're going off topic, but I kind of like it. Why would it matter the urgency in Mark? What was going on during the time that Mark was being written? By whom?
By the Romans.
Specifically who?
Caesar?
Nope.
Not Herod. That was the
This is one of the reasons why we know when Mark was written, why it was written, and for whom it was written. What major events was going on in 68? This is prior to which also gives context, because when did the temple get 70 exactly? So we know this took place before that, because there's no mention of the temple being destroyed, which would have been a big deal. In fact, you see the prophecies in Matthew and Mark talking about, the temple. And a lot of the things that we take as prophecies for the end of times were actually prophecies about the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. Correct. Some of them have dual layers of interpretation that are necessary. Exactly. And same with John and Revelation. It's John, in fact, it's not just dual; it's like 5 layers, which makes it hard to. But anyway, but for Matthew, for Matthew and Mark, but for Mark especially, Mark is the shortest of the Gospels. It is written almost like an action comic book.
They say it's best for teenagers to read the Mark because it's action.
Right. And that's why it's biblical animal. From I think it's Ezekiel. Yes, it's Ezekiel and the book of Revelation that have the 4 animalistic depictions of the Gospels. And what is Mark's? What is the animal depiction of Mark's Gospel? The lion.
Is what I was going to say.
Because it literally roars off the page at you. I mean, it's powerful and kingly.
Jesus did he healed that quadriplegic when they brought him through the ceiling.
That's in multiple texts, not just in Mark. In fact, it's one of the ones that's so important. I believe it's in all 3 synoptic gospels. But what's important for us to understand is that the temple is not destroyed. It's very, very short. And what is the message here? The message in Mark is one of hope, the one of the idea of all of this suffering has a purpose, that there is somebody that's reason for this. Now, why would that matter? Because at the time, they're getting slaughtered. Why are they getting slaughtered? Like, absolutely, like, we're not just talking normal persecution. We're talking full-bore persecution and killing, to the point where the Christians in Rome were probably thinking, oh my gosh, what's going to happen? The disciples are dead or dying. We are experiencing a persecution such that, the state itself recognizes us and is actively trying to destroy us. And at the time, there was a reason for that. Nero. What did Nero do to Rome?
Burn it down.
He burned it down. Who did he blame it on? The Christians. And so the feeling of the populace in Rome is these bad, evil Christians. So, and on top of that, his atrocities to Christianity were so horrific that it says that he had Christian bodies burning in braziers when he would take his afternoon walks in his garden.
Christians burning in what?
Braziers. So you know how you have like those fire pits to light your way and things? Instead of it being tiki torches, it was human bodies.
Like a spit, right?
Not just on a spit, like on the torch, so their bodies would basically be burning in torches, essentially, in the garden. That was the level of malevolence, hatred, and evil. This is one of the reasons why, again, when we talk about prophecies, Roman emperors wrote their names with Roman numerals. So they would not often write their names with letters. It would be with Roman numerals. Hazard to guess what Nero's Roman numerals? Exactly right. This is one of the reasons when we talk about the Antichrist, we're talking in 2 different ways. Yes, there is the Antichrist, but let's not kid ourselves. There have been many Antichrists. Stalin would be an Antichrist. Hitler would be an Antichrist. But most assuredly, and especially for the prophecies of St. John, Nero 100% was one of the prophesized Antichrists. And many of the things that Nero did, John prophesied in his work, the Revelation. This is why we know that Revelation came before his gospel. So this is why we know that Mark was probably written first because of the immediacy, the need for it. Because prior to that, everyone thought Christ is going to come back, and he did. They thought, okay, he ascended to heaven, he's going to come back, maybe a week, maybe 2 weeks, and then, now he's 33 AD. It's been 30 years. Most of the original 12 disciples are dead or in the winds from persecution. So the church recognized we need to write this down, because even though there's still the sense of immediacy, and there needs to be that sense of immediacy. People say, oh, are we in the end times? Yes, my child. We've been in the end times since Christ ascended into heaven. We've been in the end times. And he could come back any minute. And we have to prepare ourselves as. So then there was a need. There was this critical juncture where it was like, if we don't write it down, then forget oral history. It's going to be gone. And so it was imperative that Mark in Matthew and another place, be written, so that even if the 12 disciples were all killed, there would be someone that was a first-person remembrance of what happened. Mark was not that, but Peter certainly was. And so Mark, who was Peter's disciple, and also St. Paul's disciple too, during the missionary journeys. Exactly. So it's fun when you read Acts and you realize, oh wait, that's this person? Yes, that's this person. But anyway, even though it is Mark's gospel, the gospel according to St. Mark, it is actually more likely St. Peter's recollections. Matthew, however, is not a second-person recollection. It is a first-person recollection because he,
the tax collector.
correct, because he was one of the 12 disciples. So Matthew and John, they're first-person accounts. Mark is first-person. If we were to take it that Peter was dictating, which we don't know, then it would be considered a first-person account through Peter. But because we don't know that, we have to take it as a second-person account, the same way that we would take St. Luke. Right, and he was one of the 70. But he was not one of the 12. So he would have been with Christ a lot. He probably was physically present at the majority of the major events, but he was not in the same proximity as the 12. So all of that together tells us how many different, things that we have going on. And yet somehow all of it, when meshed together, is the unvarnished witness of God. But all of this together is important. Every single word, even if it seems silly or just extraneous, means something. Now, for myself, last Sunday, I saw one word in the gospel, and it changed the meaning of the gospel passage continuously. Does anyone remember what the gospel passage was this past Sunday? It was the healing of a blind man. Now, of course, Jesus, of course, heals blind people, but we have to understand that every time Jesus Christ does a healing, St. John the theologian tells us that if everything Jesus Christ did, the world could not hold the book. So in other words, each miracle placed in the writing, there's a reason why that one was picked out of all the hundreds and hundreds, maybe thousands of miracles that he witnessed Jesus Christ do. He decided to talk about this one. So why? What was important about that one? In this case, it's the man who is on the streets of Jericho. And he's crying out, "Son of David, have mercy on me." And all the people around him said, "Be quiet, hush." And he cried out all the more, "Son of David, have mercy on me." And then Jesus had him brought to him and said, "What do you want?" "Give me my sight." And Jesus Christ said, "Your faith has made you well." And then the man followed him. Now, all of that's important, right? And we're looking at the overall story. It's like, okay, good, this is important. So how do you interpret that? How do you interpret that? What is like your takeaway moment from that? Anything's possible through Jesus.
And the fact that these blind people thought Jesus is the son of David.
Right.
And also, he healed someone who's from the disenfranchised.
Someone that's disenfranchised, someone that's down there. And not, how do we know this person's disenfranchised?
Well, that's why he's blind and he's from that area, Jericho, which is not
He's considered
not a good area.
marginalized.
He's considered marginalized, but we also see the fact, how did the people treat him?
Well, they try to quiet him down.
They try to shut him down. And this would look at that as the service elements. Like, okay, don't let people be quiet. Always, not just be obedient, but always like cry after God. Don't let anyone hush you down. But this miracle itself could have taken place anywhere. It could have been any blind person. Jesus Christ healed blind people all over the place. Why was the word Jericho necessary? It's not that it's just historical, because if we look just for historical accuracies in the Bible, we're going to be left wanting. That's correct. The reason why Jericho was important was to understand that this person symbolically in hell. This man who was in hell in the darkness, and that the people that are essentially telling him to shut up were demons. And so this moment is not just okay, Jesus healed a blind person. And it's not just that he was a marginalized person. It's not just that people were telling him to be quiet. This is an element Jesus Christ is willing to go into hell to rescue you. And that we need to cry out for help, and he will bring it.
And that's the foreshadowing.
Exactly. It's the foreshadowing of his descent into Hades to save us. And yet, if you just look at it as like, oh, okay, well, he's a blind person. So much more than that. It's so much deeper than that. And so every single word matters. That word Jericho gives you all the context you need to understand that this is bigger than just a normal healing. And every single word in the New Testament and in the Old Testament, as we looked at, we agree that there's probably multiple authors to the creation story of Genesis, and yet we take all of it as important. And every single word in there is critical towards our salvation.
When you say there are 3 authors of Genesis, who are they?
We don't know.
Moses is one of them.
For sure, we believe that Moses is one of them. But there's also two other main camps that I've been told: the Eloistic, which are the priestly class, and I forget the term for the other one, but basically the kingly class. So we're looking at social, and we're looking at religious, and we're looking at possibly Moses. And so that's one of the reasons why you see 3 specific, different stories of creation.
And which are they? Genesis, Numbers, and
No,
Exodus?
No. All within Genesis,
Oh,
and back to back.
Do the Jewish religious leaders feel the same way, that there are 3 different possible voices in this, or do they all think it attributed all to Moses?
There's multiple schools of thought in this. For example, majority of the letters of the New Testament, who wrote them?
Oh,
And yet, we as Christians are willing to admit that some of them that are attributed to Paul probably didn't write.
dictate.
Well, maybe he did, maybe he didn't. This is one of those cases where people, if they want to be taken seriously, say, oh, I'm St. Paul, and writing something. So, for example, one of my favorite saints is Dionysius the Areopagite. His writings are, when did he live? St. Dionysius the Areopagite. He's in Acts of the Apostles. Dionysius the Areopagite. The Areopagus is the place in Athens where the philosophers would get up and they would talk. Well, Dionysius the Areopagite is the 2nd bishop of Athens, which means that he's a 1st century person. And yet, if you read the writings that are quote unquote Dionysius the Areopagite, they're almost word for word Plotinus, which was a Neoplatonist philosopher of the 4th century. So we can assume very easily that this Dionysius was a disciple of Plotinus, because his philosophy is so lockstep that there's just no way. It's impossible to say that somebody 3 centuries prior was writing in the exact same cadence, style, and philosophical mindset as this philosophy that's not going to be available for 3 centuries. And yet he wrote his works claiming to be Dionysius. Why did he do that? So that people would read it. They're not going to read Joe Schmo from, backwoods. It's like, oh, but this is from Dionysius. Oh. And it was the same thing with the letters from St. Paul. Is that, did he write all of them? Maybe he did, maybe he didn't. The writing style is a little bit different in some of them. And one of the works, he says, I'm writing with my own hands. Now, some people look at it like, oh, well, maybe St. Paul was illiterate, or maybe he had difficulty writing, or going blind. But if we look at the story of St. Paul, I mean, St. Paul studied under Gamaliel, probably the greatest theological mind of his time. And St. Paul is like Oxford trained. If we're talking about level of education that he received.
Where did he get it at?
He studied under Gamaliel. Gamaliel is
G-E-M-I-E-L?
yes. He was basically the greatest scholar of his age. This is one of the reasons why St. Paul claimed that he had such pedigree, and he did. This was one of the reasons why when they were stoning St. Stephen rather, even though St. Paul was young, they all deferred to him because he was considered basically the greatest mind of his era. So he was basically the Jew of Jews. This is again why when we look at his conversion, it's so significant because as far as we can look at, St. Paul had it all. He was a true-born Roman citizen. He was of a very high-class level of Judaism from the tribe of Benjamin. And he was trained under Gamaliel. So he had everything that he could possibly want. I mean, he could have lived out his whole life respected and loved on all levels of society. And yet he threw it all away to become a Christian. So that being said, it's highly unlikely that St. Paul didn't actually write his works. I think when I'm seeing what large letters I'm writing, it's basically say, all right, you idiots, this is important. That, again, like I said, the reality is that we are willing to accept as biblical scholars that maybe he didn't write all of it. And yet, by the Holy Spirit, it made it into the New Testament because what was said was more important than who said it.
What evidence do we have that Hebrews was written by Paul?
I believe it's just writing style. It's very similar to Romans. We know 100% he wrote Romans. Romans is his masterpiece. And so you look at kind of the literary style and kind of his message, because there's certain things, the elements that he says again and again.
This is Paul, right?
Right.
So Christ didn't write anything, right?
The only thing we know he wrote was something in the sand.
What is the word of adultery?
Yeah.
And this is important, especially as Christians. Why is it so critical to us that it's more important what was written than who wrote it? We see this within the person of St. Paul himself. Which of the 12 disciples taught St. Paul his Christianity?
Peter?
Was it one of the apostles?
Nope.
Who was it?
It was a priest. It was just a simple priest. So the only person that he really talked to, and this was after years of studying beforehand, yes, he did talk to St. Peter, and he got close to St. Peter, enough that they eventually locked heads, and which eventually gave us the first council of Jerusalem. But the only real disciple that he interacted with wasn't even one of the 12. It was one of the 70, which Jacobus, the first bishop of Jerusalem.
James.
Yes. And so,
His stepbrother.
correct. And so St. Paul really did not have a first-tier revelation, even though he did have, of course, the ultimate revelation by being brought up into heaven. But the point that we're trying to make here is that St. Paul was not trained by the 12 disciples. He was trained first by what would be considered, I guess, third tier, one of the priests, and then second tier, one of the 7. He was not trained by one of the 12. And yet St. Paul is considered one of the foremost of the theologians of the first century, gave us the majority of the New Testament. Again, why is that important? Why do we care so much that it's not about what was written, but not about who wrote about what was written? It's to show us that the truth is what matters. Christ is what matters. That the message of Christ can be given to us by any vessel. This is not like other religions where we trace our whole theology and rationale to one person. Right. We're not looking at like John Wesley or Muhammad. We're looking at Jesus Christ and all of it. And this is what makes it so powerful, is that it's hundreds of different authors, and they all agree that there's harmony within the message of Christ. That it is not something that changes from one person to the next person. It's all together. It is the agreement of the fathers. No one person has the entirety of the truth outside of Christ. Every other person, there's something wrong. There's something that's going to be a mistake because we're fallible, we're human. And that's why, yes, there are contradictions in the Bible. So what? This is godly inspired but human written. But the message, that is what matters. This is, for the Jews, this would be considered a history book. For the Christian, it is considered a textbook. So let's get back to the question. Would the Jews have looked at it as such? In the same way that the Christians, some will say, no way, absolutely not. Paul wrote all of them. Done deal. There would be some Jews that would say, absolutely none. No way. Moses wrote all of it. And yet there would be also Jewish scholars that would say, well, I'm sure Moses wrote a good portion of it, but I'm willing to accept that there were other authors, and it doesn't change the wording or the message or what ultimately comes from it. You know, I can accept that. That's not going to change what's written, and it's not going to change how we interpret it. If it turns out tomorrow that Moses wrote a bit and then Joshua wrote a little bit more, is that going to change the message of what's there or what happened? No. What would matter is if there was something was written and then this is like radically different. At best, what we're seeing is different perspectives that are, again, adding more context to the whole. It is not contradicting the message. The historicity might be contradicting. For example, the Synoptic Gospels, how many years is Jesus Christ's ministry? 1. Whereas in John, it's 3 years.
What does synoptic mean?
Synoptic is the word syn, S-Y-N, similar, optic, eye. So synoptic means similar view. So the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are all treating the message of Christ in a very similar way. This is why when we say Synoptic Gospels, that you'll see the same event happening in all 3 of them, and written very similarly. So that's why it's like, okay, this is similar. Whereas John, the Ioannine Gospel, is, even though there are elements of it that are still synoptic, because there are events that happen in all 4, not just the resurrection, not just the crucifixion, but certain events in his ministry. But there are certain things that are only in John. For example, the raising of Lazarus. This is something that is only in the Gospel of John.
He focused on the deity of Christ a lot more so.
Correct. His was much more theological. This is why for the Orthodox Church, we are considered more an Ioannine gospel, whereas most Protestant churches are more synoptic gospel based. And again, if we look to the biblical animal of the gospel, what is John's animal?
Mark's was the lion.
Mark's was the lion. Matthew is the angel. Luke is the bull, the calf. Yes. St. John is the eagle because it literally soared over your head.
Okay.
It's just this radius, like, oh my gosh. This is one of the reasons why in the pulpit of most Orthodox churches, what is the animal that's on top of the pulpit?
The eagle.
The eagle. Because most of the theology is Ioannine theology. And it's soaring to our mind. It's flying. It's not pedestrian. It's not simple. It's godly. I mean, for goodness sakes, the very first words, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God. Like, whoa! Just right from the start, it just goes there. Which for the Greeks, it would have looked like, okay, yeah, sure, that's miraculous. The Logos, we know about that. But again, that's very philosophical, very theological. Does not feel the same way as Matthew and Luke, which is, okay, this is the genealogy of Jesus Christ, which is what the Jews were used to. So this is, different perspectives, but all coming back together for one solid message.
Matthew was written for the Jews, wasn't it?
Right. And even the genealogies are focusing on different individuals. One is a genealogy focusing on Joseph's line. The other one's focusing on Mary's line. And again, why? Why is it necessary that we have 2 different lines? And somebody might look like, wasn't that contradictory? No, it's not. Because there are elements in that genealogy that are supposed to be important to us. And one of the Sundays leading up to Christmas, we go over the genealogy of Jesus Christ. And when you pay attention, like, wait a second, whoa. For example, one of the genealogy elements of Jesus Christ was a Moabite. Now, what's a Moabite? Do you recall?
Definitely non-Jew.
So a Moabite from the daughter Moab is from Lot.
From Lot.
Yeah. Which meant that it is the product of what?
Incest.
Sodom and Gomorrah.
No. Well, in a way, because they lived there, but
Incest.
Right.
the Moabites, Moab and her sister, slept with their father.
Right.
Oh, yeah.
And so for Jesus Christ to have a Moabite in his family tree, what did that tell you? Because you would think that with Jesus Christ, that means his mom has to be perfect, and her mom had to be perfect, and so forth and so forth. So back pure and radiant and pristine all the way back. It's not. He's a very big black sheep in his family. Not ashamed of it.
Jesus hung around mostly with low-class people.
Exactly, but for them, when they're looking at the idea of a king, and especially when you're talking about a king, for them to even get the idea, like, okay, why should I pay attention? Oh, he's a king. He's prophesied. He's holy. And then throw that in the mix, like, whoa, Jesus Christ subverts expectations like crazy. And it's on purpose. It's important. It's important that we understand that these elements were there. And the fact that there are women mentioned in his genealogy, despite the fact that women were considered nothing. That their impact was like, okay, part of history, and yet it's in Jesus Christ's genealogy as important figures. So this is critical to us because even from the very beginning, we're seeing societal norms thrown out the window.
Like the first people that discovered that Jesus rose from the dead were women.
Correct.
So why is it? Because we said so many things from Judaism. How come we do not follow the lineage of the child being from the mother like the Jews do?
Because for us, it is no longer lineage of blood, it's lineage of faith, which means that until you're baptized, you're not part of the body. This is one of the reasons why if an infant dies, let's say, they will not have an Orthodox funeral prior to baptism. Now,
Do they believe they go to limbo like the Catholic Church?
Oh God, we don't have that heresy. And I will say that that's a heretical view. We do not have this idea of limbo. We have the foretaste of heaven, we have the foretaste of hell, but that is not limbo. We believe that a child, regardless of whether they're Orthodox, regardless of whether they're getting an Orthodox funeral, does the Orthodox funeral preclude that you're going to heaven? And yet you'd be surprised how many people will do everything in their power when they're getting close to death to say, oh my gosh, I got to get right with the church because I have to have an Orthodox funeral. As if somehow the funeral arrangements is going to affect eternity. Exactly right.
We have to have a relationship.
Exactly. And who has a better relationship than a pure child, an infant? Let's be real. That child has no need of a funeral for mourning and things like that because the reality is that child
is sinless.
Is sinless. That child is front of the line as far as paradise. So regardless of whether it has an Orthodox burial or not, although we do try to have emergency baptisms if possible for a child so that we can do the Orthodox service. But the reason why we do that is because it's for the parents, exactly, because we want the child to be part of the body, but regardless, that child is sinless. The child is going to paradise. So I know we kind of went off.
I've got an interesting movie. I got a video, and it's a Christian movie. It's about a child, 9-year-old child, having such a childlike faith, and he's able to be used by God to heal people. Mm-hmm. And it's just so beautiful because the child is so innocent, and all these people are like, this can't be, this is impossible. His father's a newsman. It was like, maybe I could get you to look at it.
Sure.
It's great. I saw it too.
It was beautiful.
Father was upset because who is this kid? And it's his own child.
Because he was an atheist and he didn't want it. Was put on the news media that this guy healed a couple of people. This little child, and they were like, he was mysterious because they didn't know who he was. Mm-hmm. And it ended up being that it was the father's, it was a news media guy's son who was doing it. He was an atheist, so he didn't want to spread this.
Well, of course. I mean, just look at yesterday, St. Barbara. Her father was an atheist, and her father was an atheist, and ultimately was the one that beheaded her. Because of
St. Barbara's father got beheaded?
No, he beheaded her.
Oh, no.
So we see this again and again in the stories of the saints.
It was a good segue.
Absolutely, and kind of nice because if we had started Joseph, we would not have finished. But for those that are on the online, Do any of you have any thoughts, questions, since we kind of went tangential this week? Now, as a reminder, we will not have class next week because it will be the feast day of St. Spiridon. So I will be at St. Spiridon Church in Palos Heights.
Okay.
But since we will be off for 2 weeks, if there's anyone that has any questions or comments or thoughts, now would be the time to entertain them.
I just think that you did a wonderful job explaining all these things. It's great that it's really refreshing because I've been part of the Orthodox Church for many years. And a lot of the priests couldn't even discuss things like this because they really didn't have an understanding of Scripture like that.
Well, I don't claim to have any real understanding.
He was good.
Mhm. We're very, very blessed that over the last couple of decades that the religious education within our seminaries have really taken it up a notch. So I would imagine that the vast majority of clergy would be able to lead Bible studies with the same clarity. That's not to say that the priests of yesteryear were not also well versed, but every priest has different strengths.
Other divorces like that. But when I'm growing up, I understand where you're coming from. It's almost like delving into the Bible to this degree for the layperson would not be. It's almost like it was like I don't want to say condescending, but they felt like we were not capable to really understand the depths.
Well, Maria, you're right in a way because the reality is that the education level of today's generation is significantly higher. But internet and just public education as it is, for people that are living their lives in basic faith, who cares? I had a Greek man tell me that, like, okay, that's fine. I don't care about all those details. I don't need all those details. I believe in Christ. That's enough for me. And you know what? Right. This goes back to basically the element of, and I'll close with this. One of my favorite passages in the Bible is the road to Emmaus in the Gospel of St. Luke, in which the two disciples, Cleopas and Luke, are on their way to Emmaus from Jerusalem.
Cleopas is the other one? Really?
Well, Cleopas is one that's named. We assume it's Luke because Luke is the author, and typically that's part of biblical style that when you're talking about yourself, you'll name the other person, but you won't name yourself. So it seems
Mark would Jesus was doing.
right.
He didn't mention his name.
Right. We understand that this is probably St. Luke himself on this walk. Well, and Jesus Christ came in and walked with them, but they didn't recognize Jesus. Now, some people are like, oh, well, these people never met Jesus. Maybe they were disciples from afar, but they've never met Jesus. Not likely. We know for a fact that both of them were part of the 70, which means that they had intimate knowledge of Jesus Christ. They knew who Jesus Christ was, and they had interacted with Jesus Christ on numerous times. And yet they didn't recognize Jesus Christ. And so Jesus Christ kind of quizzed them. Like, what are you guys talking about? They looked at him like, what? Are you the only person in Jerusalem who doesn't know what happened? And Jesus played dumb. What things? And this is concerning Jesus of Nazareth. He was a prophet, mighty in word and deed before God. And we thought he was the one to redeem Israel. They were discouraged. They were disgruntled. They were worried. They felt, well, we thought that this was it. We thought this was the Christ. And then they even say, and some of our company, women, said that they thought that they'd been told he was alive. Our company didn't see it. No one saw it, so we don't know. And what did Jesus Christ say? O foolish men and slow of heart to believe all that was spoken. Was it not necessary? And then it says, exactly, and then it says, he opened the scriptures and revealed all the prophecies concerning himself. Now, essentially that meant that they got a Bible study on the road by Jesus Christ. I'm glad that you all think that my Bible study is good. It will never be as good as a Bible study from Jesus Christ. And yet, they still didn't realize that was Jesus Christ they were talking with.
Pray.
until the breaking of the bread, which was symbolic of what?
The Last Supper. Communion.
Communion, the Eucharist, which tells us that theology is great, learning all this is wonderful, and it's wonderful because they said, did our hearts not burn within us as he opened the scriptures to us, which means that this is good. This makes us hot for the faith. This makes us excited for the faith. But this is not ultimately where we learn who and what Jesus Christ is. Where do we learn who and what Jesus Christ is? Through the Eucharist, through the sacrament, which means that despite the fact that, yes, this generation is more educated and we're able to have these deeper conversations, but that does not take away the faith or the strength of that faith from the previous generation that may have just been farmers and not understood any of this. Or, which is my example, which is, I don't like the concept of where we say, oh, well, you can't baptize infants. They don't understand their faith. Oh, and you're going to tell me that somebody with Down syndrome does? That somebody with Down syndrome or severe autism, like deep down the spectrum, is going to understand deeply their faith? No, they're not going to. They're not going to be able to tell you the intricacies of the Holy Trinity. They're not going to be able to tell you about each word of the Bible. And yet I challenge you to find someone that has more faith and more able to receive the Holy Spirit than they. Which tells me that when they participate in the Eucharist, when they are participating in the sacraments of Christ, they understand and know God perfectly well. Just all of us do. This is why that moment in Emmaus was so important, because it tells us, yeah, Bible study is great. Help us deepen our faith, get us on fire for the Holy Spirit. But where will we know God? This is what people told me. It's like, Father, aren't you worried about people, like we stream our liturgies now? Aren't you worried that people are going to stop coming to church? They'll just say, I can stay at home.
Yeah.
Watch the liturgy, but that's not going to replace the Eucharist. Without that, what else is there? And so that to me is the most important element of Bible study, because it tells me that this is wonderful. And I hope more and more people join Bible study. But we don't look disparagingly or condescendingly towards previous generations or other teachers that might not be as able to talk about things, because yes, they have other gifts in other ways. Some are amazing preachers. Some have more patristic knowledge. And again, I'm not saying I'm a biblical scholar by any stretch of the imagination. But we look to the people that have that faith and we understand, my God, that's what's important. And that, again, this is what goes back to when we're studying here on Abraham himself, because all of this is going back to that we are children of Abraham, not by blood, but by faith. All right, beloved brothers and sisters in Christ, I will leave us here, and we will see each other again in 2 weeks. Heavenly Comforter, Spirit of truth, present all places and filling all things, come and dwell in us, cleanse every stain and save our souls, O gracious Lord. Amen. Have a blessed day, everybody.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Bye.